babe, but shall I keep him? 'Twill come the day when I'll be weeping, but how can I love him any less? This little babe upon my breast. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. I've got a body dark and strong. I was young, but not for long. You took me to bed, a little girl, left me in a woman's world. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. Day by day, I work the line. Every minute overtime. Fingers nimble, fingers quick. My fingers bleed to make you rich. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. You can take my body, you can take my bones, take my blood, but not my soul. You can take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. Take my body, you can take my bones, you can take my blood, but not my soul. I've got a babe, but shall I keep it?
Hello, happy Sunday, and thank you so much for joining us today for a matinee screening of the incredible film, The Red Cape. I don't know about you, I used to love a good matinee at the theater or the movies, so while it's not quite the same, it is really nice just to be here in this virtual space with all of you today to watch this film. My popcorn's not quite as good as AMC's, but I'll make do. So my name is Christie Norris. I'm the director of Carolina K-12 at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm happy to be here today. My wonderful colleague Paul Benici is behind the scenes. If you have any technical issues as you're all getting logged in and settled, he's there in the chat box. You can message him for assistance. And we are delighted to bring you this program today in partnership with the amazing North Caroliniana Society. Our mission at Carolina K-12 is to serve our state's hardworking teachers with free, high-quality resources and programs. And so for all the teachers tuning in this afternoon, if you know me, you know I've got to say it. Thank you. Thank you for persevering through this unimaginable situation in your classrooms, frankly, both in a pandemic and even before the pandemic. We want you to know that you are valued, you are appreciated, and we're here to support you with whatever you need. This event is part of the William Friday Virtual Education Series, sponsored by the North Caroliniana Society. The Society is an organization founded by H.G. Jones and dedicated to the promotion and increased knowledge and appreciation of North Carolina's history and heritage. And Carolina K-12's partnership with the Society has allowed us to serve hundreds upon hundreds of North Carolina teachers with free quality professional development, both in person and now virtual, because the Society, like us, understands the importance of teachers, is valued professionals and lifelong learners and scholars yourselves, that you guys need and deserve the time and the space for high quality lifelong learning. And as a former middle school teacher myself, believe me, I am so appreciative of them for their active appreciation and support of our state's teachers. So tonight, we will be traveling back to 1898 Wilmington. And it's important to note that Wilmington, North Carolina in the 1800s was really a symbol of Black hope and progress. 1898 Wilmington's population was majority Black and was considered really a post-Reconstruction Mecca in many ways, a place where a people only recently enslaved and freed showed resilience and resistance and fortitude and entrepreneurship. Just to name a few examples, 3 of 10 members of the Board of Aldermen were Black in Wilmington. African Americans accounted for 30% of the area's skilled craftsmen. And Alexander and Frank Manley in Wilmington owned the only Black daily newspaper in America. And this was aided by the fact that in the 1890s, the then Republicans and populists joined forces into an interracial fusion party, supported by farmers, white workers, and Blacks alike. Fusionists passed election laws that enfranchised African Americans. So in the election of 1896, the Fusion Coalition once again swept the state election. And it was this political climate that led to those 3 Black aldermen in Wilmington to get elected, as well as folks such as Congressman George Henry White. But that proved to be too much power and success for the systems of white supremacy of the time to handle. In 1898, 122 years ago, white supremacists violently waged a statewide campaign of propaganda and strategically stoked violence and racist hatred, which resulted in a massacre of Wilmington's Black community and the only proven overthrow of a government throughout United States history. This happened just 122 years ago, almost to the day, here in North Carolina, the state that I speak to you from today. A state which still has many buildings named after the very perpetrators of this coup and statues heralding them for other aspects of their careers. Many folks who've gone through North Carolina's K-12 schools never learn this history, and much later in life when they hear about it are in shock, asking why was it never covered in their classrooms. There are a few reasons for that. One, there was a strategic revisionist rewriting of our history texts in the 1900s after the Wilmington Coup. And that often happens when the very perpetrators of the coup control the curriculum. And the events that took place in Wilmington were purposefully hidden and the narrative of the truth completely distorted. And also, too, even today, many teachers feel afraid of repercussions for teaching this type of history. We know you worry about being labeled as biased or indoctrinating students just for telling the truth and sharing a comprehensive narrative of our shared past. And so here we are this afternoon to shine a light on this still, in some ways, buried state and national history, and to also help each of you learn more, ask questions, and start to consider the various ways you can integrate this event and all that's connected to it into your courses. As an aside, we'll be sending out a massive list of resources in a few days after this event, including lesson plans, vetted readings, primary sources, all to help you teach about this period and event. And ultimately, this is all because we at Carolina K-12 agree with what Brian Stevenson so wisely said. Our history has scarred us, it has bruised us, and it has injured us. But when we tell the truth about our history, we can change things. We can get to something that feels more like freedom, and we can achieve something that looks more like justice. We can shift this narrative that has burdened us and resurrect the hope that animates many of us. This is the power of teachers in the classroom. This is the power of community members who are empowered with knowledge. And so today, as our window into this hard history, we'll be watching the dramatic 40-minute film, The Red Cape, written, directed, and produced by Nelson Oliver, who will be joining us after the film, along with several other incredible panelists who I'll introduce a little bit later. And while The Red Cape is a fictional dramatization, remember, it is based in fact. The film's creators, in fact, did over 2 years of research into this event. So we'll have a conversation later. Remember, that conversation will be based on your questions, the questions that you posed when registering, and also the questions that you put into the Q&A box there in the banner of your screen. Those questions don't show up unless we answer in writing. So just know that we do see those. The panelists will get those as you type those in throughout. You'll all stay muted with cameras off, just for safety's sake throughout the film and throughout the discussion later. So don't worry if you haven't done your hair today or taken a shower in like a week, you're safe. I do want to offer just one word of caution before we start the film. It does portray the violence committed in Wilmington in 1898, violence against Black citizens, has very intense imagery. It also includes racist hate speech that was used at the time. So please just be kind to your soul as you watch, breathe, take a break if you need to. We know this history feels so personal and raw to many of you, so just be mindful of that. And the last thing I'll say before I push play and we start our experience here is just another final note about our intention to ground us now and in the conversation that we're going to have later, which is summed up really well in a quote from the wonderful book, Democracy Betrayed by David Sloselsky and Tim Tyson. We look to Wilmington 1898 as to all this nation's racial history, not to wring our hands in a fruitless nostalgia of pain, but to redeem a democratic promise rooted in the living ingredients of American life. So with that, please enjoy The Red Cape. Cinematic Arts. His 2012 internship at the Kennedy Marshall Company led to a full-time position at Steven Spielberg's Amblin DreamWorks the following year, where he works today. And he continues to write and develop material in Los Angeles, from where he joins us today. Nelson, hi, thank you for being here.
Hi, Christie. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, and thank you for this film. We'll come back and start to talk about that. I'm going to go ahead and introduce to Maxwell Paige, who you might recognize even without his collar, played the Reverend in The Red Cape. Such a beautiful performance, Maxwell. He's a seasoned and versatile stage actor and film actor whose notable stage credits include A Raisin in the Sun, Miss Evers' Boys, Driving Miss Daisy, Cobb, The Full Monty, The Color Purple, and most recently, 1776. His film credits include Inkwell, Stomping at the Savoy, Freedom Song, and of course, The Red Cape, which you just saw him in. Maxwell, thank you for being here. You'll be signing autographs later, right? Well, we can do that virtually somehow. Nathaniel Cullors, who I'm so happy to see you, Nathaniel. Everybody, if Willie's okay, because there he is. You can at least for somewhat just breathe a sigh of relief. He's all grown up. Nathaniel was born in Japan and moved to the States, where at age 6 he booked his first movie, The Red Cape, playing the adorable, heart-wrenching young role of Willie. He since then has kind of exploded with a career. No surprising. He's appeared in various print work and commercials for Nike, Schlitterbahn Print, and SafeLink Wireless. At age 12, he booked and closed Motown the Musical on Broadway. Maybe some of you caught him in that. At 14, he then in fact toured Motown for the first national tour, and he's performed on NBC's Little Big Shots. He's performed at Indirect Le Univers in Montreal, Canada for Celine Dion. This guy is just a star. So we're really happy that you're here with us today. And we're happy that Willie,
Pleasure.
yeah, I'm just so happy to see your face after that film. It feels good. Cori Greer Banks, who we might say is the biggest star on this panel based on what she does, but she was raised in Dayton, Ohio and Virginia Beach as a self-proclaimed military brat. She's also lived all over the world in different parts of the country. She graduated from the University of Maryland in Heidelberg, Germany, actually, with a BA in history. She's my fellow history nerd here. She received a master's in English from ODU in Norfolk, Virginia. She's a voracious reader. She loves to learn about history and social justice. Her heroes are Eleanor Roosevelt, James Baldwin, Zora Neale Hurston, and Toni Morrison. She loves to travel and immerse herself in unfamiliar places. She is an amazing teacher and has been teaching almost 20 years because she started when she was 4 years old, by the looks of her. And she's in her 4th year at the incredible Explorers School in Raleigh, North Carolina. Cori, you are on Zoom all week long with your students, but here you are with us today. So we appreciate you for that, because I'm sure you are having some Zoom fatigue.
Oh yeah, but I couldn't resist this.
I know, yeah. Well, thank you. And last but not least, Miss LeRae Umfleet currently works with the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Throughout her just crazy amazing career in public history, she's worked with the Office of Archives and History, with the North Carolina Collection and Davis Library in Chapel Hill, Historic Hope Plantation in Windsor. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. She served on the board of directors for the North Carolina Museums Council, the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center, the North Carolina Preservation Consortium, Historic Stagville Foundation, and that's just to name a few. But perhaps most relevant for this conversation, you should know that LeRae wrote and published A Day of Blood, the 1898 Wilmington race riot. Paul's put that into the chat, little commercial there. It's an incredible book full of just incredible primary sources, especially on this history. And she actually, based on her research for 1898 Wilmington, was given the American Association of State and Local History Award, their Award of Merit, prestigious WOW Award. And LeRae, it is so good to have you here. Thanks for being here. And I'm actually going to start this conversation with you, the historian. You know, we know you know all kinds of stuff after that bio. But start us out with kind of a quick history lesson 101 about 1898 Wilmington. I think it's easy to view that film and think, well, that was dramatic. That could never have happened in real life. But in actuality, while it is a dramatic portrayal with some fictionalized characters, it is based in fact. And so could you hit some of the main points of the 1898 events? You know, what's most important for us to know? And you know, of course, he's, you know, sitting over here virtually beside you, but in your opinion, did these guys do a good job portraying what we know these events to be? So let's give you some time here to history us.
Well, you only gave me about 10 minutes, so I will do my best to stay within the 10 minutes. But yes, Nelson and his entire wonderful crew did an amazing job. And I finished wiping my eyes right before we went back live. And I've seen it multiple times, but every time I see it, it gets to me because he pulled out all the parts that put the story together in a nice snapshot of, it was a political campaign in 1898. You briefly spoke about some of these things at the opening. And we have to remember the politics of 1898. Democrats and Republicans are not Democrats and Republicans of 2020. Mm-hmm. They almost have an exact opposite philosophy. So 1898 was the result of a hate-filled white supremacy campaign by the Democratic Party to regain control of North Carolina in 1898. And so they implemented a 3-pronged attack because they didn't have Twitter and television news channels on a 24-hour cycle. They had a program where they used people who could write, which was the newspapers, people who could speak, which were people like Alfred Moore Waddell, who got a lot of screen time in Nelson's movie, and Waddell was not a nice guy, and so he got what he deserved in the coverage on the film. And people who could ride, which were the red shirts. And the red shirts are some of those men with the shirts with the stripes on their sleeves in the movie. And they were the militaristic, terroristic arm of the Democratic Party. And they were the ones responsible for much of the violence before the violence on November 10th and the day of. So we call it a riot, we call it a massacre, we call it a coup. And all of those things mean different pieces. A riot is full of chaos in the streets and murder and just chaos. And so we have a riot. We have a massacre because we have untold numbers of African-American men shot in the streets for no reason other than they were African-American. And we have a coup, which is the overthrow of the government. And Nelson portrayed that very well too, because we had armed men in City Hall, and Waddell oversaw the change in government in a matter of hours. We went from a legally elected government to an armed overthrow of that government, and it stuck. And so that makes it the only successful coup in United States history. And while the cause of the violence on November 1898 was that of a political nature, we have to remember the overall implications. We have the tragedies that we brought out with the murders in this movie. We have the disfranchisement that comes with what happened in 1898. North Carolina didn't implement its first Jim Crow legislation until after the legislature that was elected in 1898 came into office. So we have our first separate but equal separation of the races based on Plessy versus Ferguson in 1899. And so we have all of these layers of results of 1898. Additionally, we have African Americans in Wilmington, that what could have been this gilded city that could have been the wonderful opening for African Americans and whites at the beginning of the 20th century, all of that stops. And if you're African American, you instantly move into a second class status. You're making less money, you have less security in your home, you have less educational opportunity, and so things change for the African American population of Wilmington in every way as a result of November 10th. And so Nelson took all the scary that I saw when I was doing the research and writing and put them into the movie, because of politics, people were murdered in the streets, children were threatened, and he put it all together in a good framework. And it's so well based in fact, and the flow and the transition of everything that happens in the movie is so well. I mean, he must have gone to every presentation I gave in Wilmington and listened to me and picked out all the scary things that I talked about, because he put them all in the movie. And you know, the ending where we have the deaths and discussion of the deaths, I only can find one burial in the African American cemetery in Wilmington that has November 10th, 1898 as a death date, because yes, people who were murdered that day were buried in secret or were placed in unmarked graves. And so we only have that one burial to point to. So it was a lot of research and writing and digging around, trying to find what the court would call circumstantial evidence to identify the number of people who died that day. But I put it at around 60. I'm sure it's much more, but we just right now don't have the documentation to answer any more of that type of question. But I say kudos to Nelson yet again, and I'll be happy to answer any questions we have.
Yeah, so we have a few coming in. So you mentioned, you know, a minimum of 60s, probably more people are murdered. You talked about, you know, because of the loss of opportunity that this overthrow created, you kind of had a massive exodus of Black folks, thousands, I think you've said, over 2,000 left the city. So Benny is asking, do we know where any of the folks exiled went after these atrocities? Has there been any research about that? Are there any records of where folks ended up after this took place?
So I dug through the 1900 census to find, because I had some hints. We had some hints about Philadelphia. We had hints about New York City and New Jersey. And so I did some census digging in 1900 census and found some of the African Americans from Wilmington in those locations. There was a huge exodus to Cape May, New Jersey, and it was actually set up as a refuge for exodus victims of 1898 in Wilmington. And yes, we have evidence of those folks going to those locations. Now, I would encourage someone, if it's not me, somebody else, go to those cities and start digging and see if we can find diaries or letters or accounts of what happened in Wilmington in those locations. I wasn't able to do that when I did my research back 10 years ago, but it's always been on my to-do list. So I always encourage folks to see if they could do that kind of extra digging, because I think that there's more detail out there about 1898. We just haven't found it yet.
Especially, I think, to get the experience of this from the Black community, right? Because there's so many primary sources that we have, but a lot of it is about the aggression. It's about the white supremacy campaign, because, thankfully or not thankfully, they were so out in the open. But to know what those experiences were like for the folks who were driven into the swamps to hide for days, who then moved. There's a question Benny's asking, if you wanted to retrace the events that occurred during the Wilmington race riots as well, where would one start? I know that the Museum of the Cape Fear was working on a virtual field trip, actually, to take you through that in Wilmington. So I don't know if it's ready yet or not, Benny, but that's one place that you can go to look at that. And the last thing I just want to drive home with you, LeRae, if you can talk about just a little bit, is this also wasn't just a one-off in Wilmington, right? Like, this was actually a complete statewide campaign, a widespread strategic campaign of white supremacy across the state. So can you talk just a little bit about that? How is information spreading? Courtney is asking, for instance, she'd like to know more about the way that the news reported the events across the state, around the nation. Like, information was traveling. There were red shirt rallies all over the state. How was that happening, as you said, during a time where we didn't have Twitter or Facebook?
Well, we didn't have the AP press either, but we had papers like the News and Observer in Raleigh. And they had reporters all over the state who would send in articles to the NNO, and other papers would then reprint the NNO articles across the network of North Carolina's newspapers. And newspapers then weren't as clear as they are now about bias. So there were clearly Democratic Party papers and there were clearly pro-Republican Party papers. And so the Democratic Party papers, led by the News and Observer, would print any number of things that were untrue to get their point across and to get support from the voters for the party. And I'm not drawing conclusions and lines between today and then. I'm just talking about history, but you can do what you want to do. So the newspapers were very much a tool of the Democratic Party. And yes, red shirt rallies were all across North Carolina, mostly along the southern counties of North Carolina where we border South Carolina, because the red shirt phenomenon came into North Carolina from South Carolina. And so the red shirt rallies were an intimidation tool, and they usually accompanied speakers like Alfred Moore Waddell and Charles Brantley Aycock and other fiery white supremacy speakers traveling across the state, trying to get people to vote for the Democratic Party's campaign platforms.
Yeah, massive rallies, right? At Fayetteville, thousands
of people, yeah.
Thousands. So, yeah. So Nelson, I want to bring you into this. We're going to keep kind of moving back and forth with the history too, but So to put it plainly, here you are, a young college guy, a young white guy who, and you end up writing and directing and producing this film about 1898 Wilmington, which at the time was, I'd say it's still somewhat unknown. And, 8-10 years ago is even more so less known. So tell us a little bit about what inspired you to create this project. Where did this vision come from, and how did you go about making it a reality?
Sure. So my first introduction to the 1898 massacre and coup was in the fall of 2005. And I was just at the Cape Fear River with a few friends from UNC Wilmington, and one of my friends said, apparently there was a massacre that had happened here where there had been a prosperous Black community, and he didn't really have any substantial information about the coup, but he just said that the Black community was terrorized and that many of the people were killed were thrown in the Cape Fear River, and that oratorical history held that the shores of the river ran red with blood. And I thought, my goodness, I grew up in North Carolina, and why have I never heard of this? And I just had a history course in UNC Wilmington, and I was just baffled that I'd never heard of it. My father was also extremely steeped in history, both United States and North Carolinian history. And I asked him if he'd ever heard of anything like that, and he hadn't. Also a native North Carolinian. So I started doing a little digging at the New Hanover Library, and also at UNC Wilmington's Randall Library. And there were small anecdotes here and there, but there really weren't any substantial factual records that were all encompassing what I was looking for. And unbeknownst to me, I didn't know all of the work that LeRae and everyone with the Wilmington Race Riot Commission, what they were doing in compiling all of this information. So that eventually came out on May 31st of 2006. And over 3/4 of a year from the time that I heard about it. And I just devoured every bit of those 400 plus pages. I could not believe that this wasn't part of our history curriculum. This was an event that had national significance. And I was just trying to share this with my friends and classmates at UNC Wilmington. And to my surprise, most of them didn't care. And that really, it outraged me that I could not get people to care about what I was learning about, that I was so shocked to learn about. And I was reminded of a lesson plan by my 10th grade English teacher. And we were learning about the Jewish Holocaust. We had just read Night by Elie Wiesel. And my teacher was trying so desperately to create a discussion about what we had read, to try and create a discussion within the classroom. And no one was really engaging with it. No one really cared to engage. And you could absolutely see the frustration on the teacher's face. The next day, she brought in Schindler's List and showed us one scene, the liquidation of the ghetto. And instantly, so many of the direct experiences that Elie Wiesel wrote about in Night became concrete realities. The classroom was literally transported from 2002 to 1942. You saw families being forcibly separated. You saw people being executed on the streets. You saw them being carted off to concentration camps. And you saw German soldiers laughing about it. So to say it to an extent might have traumatized some of my classmates, might not be a stretch, but it made it real. It made the lesson real. It made the impacts on people real. And that stuck with me so strongly that I thought, if I want to try and get people to care about what happened to real people in 1898, what happened to generations of people that lived on after that massacre and coup, perhaps we could do it through a short film. Perhaps we can get people to feel and empathize and understand what happened through that type of medium.
And so what I heard you say to all the teachers listening is that this film was basically inspired by your 10th grade teacher, by an experience in your 10th grade class. So I just want to remind teachers, at the end of the day, I know sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but you are making a difference. You know, and Nelson, we have a question. Margaret is asking, why are we still so uninformed about this dark chapter of North Carolina history? Because you're saying you didn't learn it in your K-12, you didn't learn it in college, you're not that old. Why do you think that is, that this is kind of literally covered up, so to speak?
Well, just speaking to my own experience in K-12, we very much went from the abolishment of slavery, constitutional abolishment of slavery with the 13th Amendment, and immediately skipped over nearly a century and went directly into the civil rights movements. We covered Rosa Parks, we covered Martin Luther King Jr. We really didn't even cover Malcolm X, but I think everyone that was done, I hate to say that disservice, believes that we went from slavery directly into Jim Crow segregation. And that was another surprising thing for, I think, many people to learn about 1898. In Wilmington, it's like there was this thriving Black community.
Right.
That had, you know, not only political power, they had, you know, economic power, and then they, you know, had a thriving labor force.
Right.
Specialized in various professions.
Yeah.
And I think that because of the absence in the history curriculum, we do equate it to, oh, well, slavery was abolished, and then we go to immediately into segregation, separate but equal. And that, you know, I think that for educating students about the continuum of systematic oppression, of institutional bias, is critical to really understanding how this dynamic still plays out today. I think Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th really outlines so much of that, going from slavery to Jim Crow into the era of mass incarceration that we still exist in today. And I will say that, you know, this has become a broader national conversation over the last 6 years. But I learned so much of these subjects from Maxwell Paige. And that's why listening and creating these conversations, engaging with people, and trying to create anything from public performance to theater to short films, anything where you can engage with people and listen and learn is invaluable. Like these were conversations my cast and crew and I were having 12 years ago.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I think I just want to pop back to you super quick, LeRae, because this just came up, and Victoria is asking about, you know, the diverse leadership that existed in Wilmington prior to the massacre. The kind of Wilmington is this beacon of hope. And Nelson, I think the film really shows that in the beginning too. You see it in the interactions between Black folks and white folks, in kind of this bustling city. And so, LeRae, can you just talk a little bit to sum up about what was that situation like in 1890s Wilmington? You know, we're post-Civil War. It's really just incredible to think about what Black folks were able to do only, you know, not so long after the Civil War. It says a lot about fortitude and resilience and resistance. But just give us a quick snapshot of what Wilmington was like at that time, and how did that happen?
Wilmington was the largest city in the state. It had about 20,000 people in the city limits, a slight majority African American, and it had evolved into what the Gilded Age New South could have become in a trajectory into the 20th century, with African Americans owning their own businesses, having those businesses in the main business section of downtown Wilmington with white and Black customers. And there were attorneys, teachers, lawyers, or attorneys and lawyers are the same thing, business owners, every, you know, real estate brokers, every sort of enterprise you could consider. We had African-American entrepreneurs in those positions. And regardless of your status before the emancipation, you could make it in Wilmington and make it better in Wilmington because wages were higher, even for day laborers. Home ownership was higher for African Americans in Wilmington than other sections of the state. And education accessibility was better in Wilmington for everyone, including African Americans, than other places in the state with higher literacy rates. And so Wilmington really was a wonderful place for the beginning of the 20th century for African Americans in North Carolina. It led the state in all of those ways. And as I said earlier, once things hit the wall of November 10th, 1898, all of that changed. But
Right.
so we had representation by African Americans in the legislature in Raleigh, in the state level of government. We had the Board of Aldermen had African Americans representing their wards. But yes, it was very much what we would have hoped that people could have attained by the turn of the 20th century.
Right. Well, so Maxwell, I want to pop over to you because Nelson just said so much. He said several times offline in here today that you were such an instrumental part to his conversations with you. And you did such a sensational job playing the Reverend in the film. I would love to hear from you what this process was like for you, kind of not only diving into your character, but into this history broadly. How familiar were you with these events, you know, and why did you agree to be involved in this work? What was the experience like for you?
When I got to Wilmington in 1980, I thought that I would want to be a part of the city because I liked the place where I was, but I wanted to be a part of it, like engrossed in all of the growth that had happened in before and in the future. So I got involved in politics and citizens doing stuff and local people doing things together. And I met a man by the name of Larry Rennie Thomas, who was a professor up at UNC in Chapel Hill. He gave me a dissertation that was written by, I think, a student in 1957 called They Have Taken a City. Mm-hmm. And in that, I found out a lot about the history of Wilmington, and it stirred something in me. And throughout the next few years, I was always getting tidbits of information about it, trying to make heads or tails about how all this occurred and why. And when I met Nelson and he suggested it, it was just really fit right into what I wanted to do, because in 1998, we did a play called No More Sorrow to Arise. It was written by Anne McGuire. And I actually played the Reverend, the same Reverend in that play. And so when he came to me with that, I was like, yeah, I can do that because I've already done it once. So I would love to do that again. His probing of the situation was much deeper and left a lot more impact on me as a person. And I thought it would also do the same thing on anybody who happened to watch the film.
When you say that, what do you mean it left a deep impact on you as a person?
Never knew how much Black folks had before now, before this period. I thought the entire time between the time Black folks in America were part of it, that they were always the complete downtrodden, and they never had any breaks. Everything was always against them. And I never knew how they got to the point where they were. Wow. But seeing that gave me like, okay, this was like a transition point where they went from being not having any education, no money, to all of a sudden having all of the above. And it was like, okay, even though it wasn't overnight, it happened. And
right.
So that was good. That was good to know that it wasn't just it was an oversight in history that yes. We were not credited with having had anything. And everybody thought we were like, yeah, that the white folks had done everything for us, that we had done nothing for ourselves.
That's right.
And this was really good to know.
That's a powerful statement, and it's something that, you know, we are always working with teachers on and talking to teachers about, as Cori knows too. We have got to do a better job teaching the resilience, the resistance, the strength, the power of Black people throughout time. In every period of history, there has just been constantly an incredible pushback against that adversity, right? So if you think about what folks were able to do in 1890 Wilmington, that says a lot about a people. And we need to do a better job highlighting that strength and resistance and resilience, because I think you're absolutely right. If we exclude that, we're not doing the full story justice. The other thing I wanted to ask you, I thought it was a really interesting moment in the film. I loved that moment between you and Monroe, where Monroe says to you as the Reverend, aren't you brave enough to contend to the rights of men? And you respond, I'm just happy where I am. And then later in the film, you come back on him and you say, when all the violence is happening, is this what you call contending to the rights of man? Can you speak a little bit to that interaction and what you think what the character is representing in that moment?
I portrayed another character by the name of John Chapis, who was a man from Granville County,
Yes.
a freeborn Black man who had been educated in the Episcopal situation. And he also, according to the right readings that I had on him, was a low-key person, not one to go out and start something, always kind of in the background, trying to promote peace and tranquility, but at the same time knowledgeable about what's going on, but not being able to fix it,
Right.
only being able to give absolution to those people and put some salve on their wounds or whatever they needed. But I was not the person who was supposed to go out and start anything or keep anything going, but I needed to be there when the violence was over to give people more hope that this was not the end, that they still had far to go, and God was still in control. So
Right.
I felt that was more my position than to be the perpetrator of to lead people on this march to freedom.
Right. And it's interesting, you see that dichotomy, and I think it's an important dichotomy to highlight throughout different historical moments, right? You need the people who are going to push the envelope and be on the streets, just like we see today with Black Lives Matter. But then you also need the folks who are going to kind of, serve in different roles too. There's different layers to it. You saw it in the various debates, I think, that happened throughout the long civil rights movement. So I think it was a really interesting moment to include in the film. Nathaniel, I want to bring you in here too as you sit here with your fellow film crew and actors. You were 6 years old when you played the part of Willie. I know every mama bear watching just wanted to squeeze you, wanted to like bust up through there and snatch you up. You're just adorable. You are now 19 years old. And you've gone on to a great career. Nelson said to me that to this day, you're one of the most talented actors he's ever worked with. So, this is probably a silly question, but what was it like being 6 in doing this work? If you can even remember it, you probably don't remember a lot of it. So maybe more importantly is, what is it like to now look back on this work now that you're older, now that you've gone through school and some college? What does the film mean to you today?
Well, I can say at the time it was a very awesome experience. It was kind of scary for me in some instances, yes, because it was interesting. At the time, I kind of was 6 through 10-ish, I think, that was around the filming mark. And I was learning about slavery, I was learning about Jim Crow, but obviously it was very dumbed down for obviously a 6-year-old before elementary school. So I had known about this, but Nelson was very, very upfront and forthcoming about the seriousness about the subject matter that I was supposed to be portraying. Mm-hmm. And so I think looking back on it, it has really, not only did it set me on my path to want to fight for, or I should say for social justice and activism, not only did it kind of give me that leg up on it, but it also instilled in me a lot of the importance of what happens if hatred and bigotry is allowed to permeate. Because again, at the time I was 6 years old, and I'm not really understanding a lot of the stuff that's happening here. I knew Black people's position. I knew that our history was unique. You know, again, we were studying this in class, we were studying this in school, but this was not talked about, and how deeply it ran, it was not discussed at all. And so there are moments where I would be like, well, what does this mean? What does that mean? There is a point in there where he goes, you're setting, Manley is setting himself up to get lynched. And I turn and look at Nelson, I'm like, well, what does lynching mean?
Oh,
And everybody up there is kind of like, oh, we don't know. And so they try to ask my mom, like, how upfront can we be with this? You know, how can we actually explain this to him? And she was like, no, he can understand. I was always very understanding of the seriousness of it, but you know, in order to portray this, in order to actually seriously get up here and be able to show people that emotion and to show people the seriousness of this subject, he had to be completely honest with me.
Right. It's definitely not, if you're going to do it, you've got to do it.
Straightforward.
Yeah. So you said
Absolutely.
something, I just want to pop back, Nelson, and ask you, Nathaniel just noted he was actually between the ages of 6 to 10 years old. How long did it take you guys to complete this entire filming?
Yeah, I think it was about 6 to 9 for your birthday's in June, right? May. Okay. Yeah. So it was, it was basically 6 through 9 years old for him. So yeah, the filming process took about 3 years. And, you know, there are points editorially in the film where it's like, you know, there's a shot of Nathaniel at 6, there he is at 9, there he is at 8.
I didn't notice. I did not know. I didn't.
And, you know, we were
adorable
just
the whole time.
terrified that he was going to hit a growth spurt.
Or the voice change. Oh, well,
Yeah. But you know, speaking to his, you know, his precocious qualities, he absolutely understood the history that we were presenting him with, and we did ask his mom even before we started filming. 2 months before we started filming, how much can we share with him about the history? And she did say, "Don't sugarcoat anything." So, I truly applaud both of Nathaniel's parents to eternity for, you know, really trusting that their son, that their children, because his siblings, especially his older brother, like learned about it, you know, at the same time Nathaniel did. And they understood, you know, and they would even tell other people on the set about little historical facts, and they were spot on. Like, we have it in behind the scenes video where Nathaniel's telling somebody about Alexander Manley, and he, like, his information is on track with
As like an 8-year-old. That's
yeah.
I think, Nathaniel, I love that you said that, though, because I think it gets at, you know, a lot of teachers really struggle with what's age appropriate for my students. Do I teach this hard history? It might make parents mad. We might get pushback. So I think it's really inspiring to hear that your mother was like, no, go there, because we need to face this history. And we do. You know, I often say that we're in the situation that we're in here in 2020 because we still haven't fully faced this history. So I think that's really inspiring to hear from you as a, you know, 6 to 9 or 10-year-old, the impact on you and the role that this film and the cast and crew played in educating you.
Can I just say really quickly, I love that, because at the time, learning about it in class, it seemed like it was such a distant past, like it was so far away. And it was almost hard to imagine, because I'm in a class full of mainly white kids. I'm getting taught by a white teacher. I'm only one of 4 Black kids in the class. So we're learning about our history, but it's hard to imagine that that could be a reality, because today we're all integrated. We don't see each other as different at all. So having that experience, having the Red Cape experience, and then going back to it, I'm like, they're not telling the whole story. They're not telling the full thing. And I think that's so important, because it kind of leaves you with a sense of identity loss. You don't really know how, because you're getting taught this one thing in class about how we're all equal, and you kind of get some of the tidbits of the struggles to get there, but it, just like Nelson said, it kind of almost seemed like history went from slavery to Jim Crow, Civil Rights Act, and now we're good.
Right.
And it's not like that, and it wasn't like that. So
That's not the case at all, right?
mm-mm.
Yeah, that's really incredible. So I want to bring you in, Cori, since we're talking, Nathaniel's got us on the path of talking about teachers, and you, as I say all the time, are an amazing 8th grade teacher who not only teaches about Wilmington 1898, but you like teach, like you teach Wilmington 1898.
Oh yeah, we do not skirt around it in my classroom.
Oh my God, like everybody watching should know, she takes her students on a field trip to Wilmington. She uses this film, The Red Cape, with her 8th grade students. And I'm sure there are some teachers panicking over that idea, but you're just so much brilliance in you. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, first of all, why you teach about 1898, since as we've heard, not everyone does. And also, how do you do it effectively? How do you set it up? How do you prepare your students? How do you prepare their adults to not lay an egg when you teach this history? And also, why did you make the choice to integrate this film into the wonderful work that you do?
Well, thank you, Christie, and thank all of you for allowing me this space to talk to you about what I do in the classroom every day, what now just feels like normal, and I assume is done in every classroom. So I'm happy that I'm able to offer you some suggestions about how you can integrate this into your own classrooms. Before I begin, though, I just want to say, Christie, you talked about how mama bears were, wanted to reach out to Nathaniel. Nathaniel, every year that I show this film, just know, I don't know if you feel it, but you have like, 70 8th graders that are like, go, move, run. They're like talking to you as the film is going, it's almost like they want to wrap you in plastic wrap and like just take you with them. So just know that, every year that happens in my classroom. But I feel it's really important to teach about Wilmington in realms of Reconstruction. And really that when we talk about Wilmington, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Reconstruction, the period directly after the Civil War that offered a lot of hope, not only for African Americans, for Black Americans, but for the country. Like if we look at that brief period after the Civil War and before Jim Crow, which this marks the start of Jim Crow, this and other events like it, right? But if you look at that, it's like, man, this is what our country could have been.
Right.
When you look at Reconstruction and you look at,
Abraham Galloway.
Yeah, yes, you look at these senators, you look at, this, you look at Black wealth, you look at, LeRae talked about Black home ownership in Wilmington. You had pockets of this all throughout the South, and it was cut short with Jim Crow. And so, I have people that tell me like, oh, I don't, want, I'm tired of Black people being looked at as oppressed or downtrodden. Well, teaching Reconstruction specifically, like taking time to teach that, teaches what our country could have been, teaches like the great things that we could have done had we kept going with Reconstruction, had it not been shot down with Jim Crow, with, things like the 1898 race massacre. My history classes in elementary and high school were very much like what Nelson had described, where, you are, I was taught that Lincoln freed all of the Black people and yay, Lincoln, he's our savior, right? And then, briefly mention lynching, if you talked about it at all, and then yay, Martin Luther King saves the day. And that's kind of like our study of Black people, right? And we know that there are some huge gaps in that story. I actually read The Marrow of Tradition when I was in undergrad, and this was before I even moved to North Carolina. I read this in the 90s, probably when LeRae was starting all of her research and writing her book about this, about this massacre. And when I moved to North Carolina in 2008, I thought naturally everybody knew about this event, right? Because they're North Carolinians. So 2008, I'm teaching Reconstruction, and I'm like, hey, we should teach about the 1898 massacre. And by and large, everybody I came to, natives, North Carolinians, said they don't know what I'm talking about. And here I am new to North Carolina. And I'm like, you don't know about this? Have you read The Marrow of Tradition? By then I had not read other YA novels related to this. I had not talked to Nelson Oliver about a film. And it baffled me that there was this kind of statewide amnesia about this event. It was shocking to me. And so as an 8th grade teacher, one of our standards in 8th grade is to teach American history and to teach North Carolina history. So I feel like as a teacher in 8th grade, it is my charge, if I'm going to teach about Reconstruction, to teach about the 1898 race massacre. I feel like, how can we not do that? How can we not do it? And so I feel like this is my duty. If we are going to teach state history, that we should teach about this event and teach about Reconstruction.
Yes, yes, absolutely. You know, I think, so how did your students respond to this film? It sounds like they obviously are, you know, telling Nathaniel, run, get out of the way, go home. But tell us a little bit about how do you prep them and how do you prep the parents? Because this is, it's a hard film. It's hard on the soul, right? And I know you have done so much groundwork before you push play on this film, but can you speak to that just a little bit?
Film is the very, very last piece. And so this is after we have read a novel, a young adult novel centered around this. This is after we have had a unit.
Is that Crow? Are you referring to Crow?
Yes, I'm referring to Crow. We read Crow by Barbara Wright, which is a wonderful novel. And actually, they kept confusing Nathaniel's character with Moses, the main character in Crow. They're like, Willie, Crow, Moses, Crow, move, get out of the way, you know, because this is after they've read the novel. They have looked at many primary documents. They've compared the Declaration of Independence with the white Declaration of Independence that was written by white citizens in Wilmington, North Carolina. They've looked at pieces of LeRae's book. By that time, we've traveled down to Wilmington and we've walked the path of the massacre, and we have parents come with the students. So I don't have to talk that much. They've read the novel. They've learned all about Wilmington. They've learned about Reconstruction. So the trip to Wilmington is the next to the last piece where they view the film. And so we have 80 8th graders down there, and we have their parents down there. And so the first time I took them down there, I was like, man, I am a Black woman and I don't feel exactly comfortable, you know, teaching parents who, for many of them, this might be the first time that they've actually learned about this massacre. So instead, I have the students, while we're down there, since they've already learned all of that and read a novel, they are in charge of teaching the parents about it as we make each stop. And so they actually become the teachers. And then it's, you know, it's heartwarming. Every year I take these pictures and I see my students teaching their own parents about history that their parents never knew. And so it keeps me, I'm trying to figure out, how am I going to do that in this pandemic? I don't know. But I mean,
that's a question coming up here. So you got 2 minutes to figure it out. How do we do this work in a virtual remote?
That is what I ask all the time. And then when we come back, when I press play on this film, they're just wired. They're prepped. And even we show it in class. The first year actually had LeRae and Nelson and the students organize a film festival for other schools in the Raleigh area and the public. I loved it. Was so wonderful. And the students, the Explorer students, organized it and served as moderators. It was wonderful. Of course, I wish I could have LeRae and Nelson do it every year, but I can't afford that.
We're on film here with 100 people watching. We can hold them to a commitment right here.
Yeah. But, we show it every year regardless of a film festival, but because we did all of that work building up to it, the students are like, we want to see it, and they are comparing their learning from the past couple of weeks and the trip to the film by that time. So there's no convincing.
Slow burn. Yeah. Well, there's so many great questions coming in. And one of the things that so many teachers asked as they submitted their registrations, and they're asking now, is just given today's climate, especially, teachers are wondering, how do we find the balance between not traumatizing students of color and Black students, but while we still cover the truth of white supremacy? And, Nathaniel, you might want to weigh in on this too, since you're, still kind of going through school, but, this is really hard history. We have a really fabulous question in the chat too from Benton, who's on the flip side of that, also pointing out the reality of so many teachers. How do I teach students to engage in this when some of their parents might be at racist rallies or kind of steeped in this rhetoric, because some families have very conservative politics, and this is just the world of 2020. What are your thoughts on that, on the trauma, and on the other side of that, preventing trauma, but also preventing the shame and blame, because nobody learns in either of those scenarios?
Well, for my students of color, I as a teacher of color, this weighs on me every year. This is a weighty subject, this, the idea of this massacre. But because it's weighty doesn't mean that I should shield my students of color from this truth. This is the reality that was in 1898. And in many respects, this is the reality that is still here in 2020. And to shield my students of color from that is, to me as a teacher and as a person of color, is to do them a disservice, and to me to do them harm. I have been shielded from it, and when I was a child, and to continue to do that with this generation of kids is to continue pulling wool over their eyes, and we have to take it off if we want to empower them. If we want to empower them, we have to tell them the true story. We can't keep this from them. And in that same vein, this is not all oppressive. Like when you talk about Reconstruction, talk about the wealth, talk about the opportunity. I mean, there were Black people in Wilmington and in areas all around the South that were doing big things. Talk
Black
about
Wall
Alvin
Street,
Manley,
yes.
and the fact that he was doing big things, right? And, had his own newspaper, so I'm just saying, don't shield your kids from that. Don't shield white kids from it either. There were plenty of white people that were working with the Black community all around the South. So yes, we could talk about Alfred Waddell and talk about the red shirts, but don't forget to mention that there were white people on the other side, right, working with the Black community during Reconstruction as well. And make sure when you go into this, you have the support of your administration, because I can give snaps to Explorers admin. I have had parents, even this year, that continually come out and try to give me the pushback, try to make things difficult. And it really helps to have an administration that's like, nope, this is what our school is about. You make the choice. This is our school and this is our culture.
I love that. And just so everybody knows, we're not expecting Cori to do, to say it all right now. And the resources you get in the next day or so, it includes kind of a tips and tricks sheet for how to, all the things you want to think about when you get ready to teach hard history. It includes lesson plans. And as you so well said, Cori, so much of this is about, I love the quote from Dr. Hassan Jeffries from the Teaching Hard History, Teaching Tolerance Report, that hard history does not have to be hopeless history. You teach the hard history, but you have to empower students with the way that you teach it. So you don't just teach about slavery as a people getting smacked down and driven into the ground. Obviously, it was terrible and bad, and we need to teach that, but you also need to teach the resistance, teach the Abraham Galloways, teach, just like Cori was saying, the power piece, the rising against adversity piece, because that's always been there. We talked a little bit, Nelson, you mentioned the Holocaust earlier. I think the guide, the United States Memorial Holocaust Museum's Guide to Teaching the Holocaust, is actually really helpful for teaching the history of slavery and Reconstruction, because it's all about recommendations of not going for shock value. It's about teaching the individuality, the humanity. And so I think that's really, really important for this work. And I think it's also important to consider that to not teach about the history of white supremacy is in fact to teach a white supremacist curriculum, right? If you ignore all of that, if we don't face it, we're kind of, as you said, pulling the wool over, and kids know that it's not the full story. And I think they get very resentful of that. And I know you're so amazing at doing that.
You know,
Yeah, go ahead.
I have so many 8th grade students who come into my classroom, and they have extensive knowledge of war. They have extensive knowledge of weapons in World War II, the evolution of rifles from the Revolutionary War all the way up to Iraq, which kind of gives me pause. And I'm like, why do you know so much about weapons? So why do we say that it's okay to teach about things like World War II or Revolutionary War, but it's too hard to teach about things like white supremacy? And I think to answer that question is to come face to face with some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and about our country. And I think that's the heart as to why really people are so uncomfortable with talking about that subject matter in our classrooms.
Right. And until we lean into it, right? Until you lean into that discomfort, we're gonna stay where we are, right? So, I want to, Nelson and Maxwell and Nathaniel, to go back to kind of thinking about the film specifically. Cori talked about this. She's integrating the film. She's integrating this wonderful young adult novel, Crow. And I think we were always pushing teachers to integrate vetted quality art, whether it's film or literature or visual art or performance. This is such a powerful entry point for hard history. And it's also a really incredible way, as you guys were talking about early, to cultivate empathy, to humanize and to cultivate empathy. And, I really wonder, given the beautiful role, the centering of this story around Willie and the relationship with his father, was that a specific goal of yours? Is that why you chose to kind of build the story around their particular relationship?
Yes, my primary consideration with that was really how to best convey the multiple aspects of that tragedy, and what kinds of characters to focalize that story through and that history around. So you could, I naturally have thought like, well, Alexander Manly is central, but to focus too much on Alexander Manly might detract from the greater impacts that the massacre and violence had on the broader community and the families and generations that would follow. So I really thought about focalizing a large part of the story through the character of Willie. And even, as you'd mentioned with Maxwell previously, showing these colliding points of view about how to best achieve progress between his father character Monroe and the Reverend. One saying we need to aggressively march forward and be fearless, and the other one saying, I've lived through more history and this could end badly. But in particular with Willie, I wanted to choose a perspective that every viewer could relate to, and that's the perspective of a child. No matter what race or ethnic background we come from, we all understand what it was to be a child. And I thought it was interesting to present this overarching socio-political conflict through the eyes of someone who didn't particularly understand it, in the same way that the intended viewers, particularly, 8th graders and above, might also not understand all the nuances that were at play. And then most importantly, Willie's character is the embodiment of the future generations for which nothing was left. To have experienced this moment in time, this moment in Wilmington and United States history, where your community was thriving and opportunity was present, to have that all taken away, to have suffered the trauma of such racial violence, that domestic terrorism, doesn't end on November 10th.
That's right.
That persists for a lifetime. That travels across generations. That was the real purpose of presenting so much of the story through the eyes of Willie. And, you know, that really comes down to his final possession. The blanket that he carries with his mother's blanket is representative of memory. So it begins as the memory of his mother, but it concludes as his only possession moving forward, which is the memory this memory of this massacre that he'll carry with him the rest of his life.
Interesting. So on that note, you know, of carrying through generations, LeRae, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about what are the connections between 1898 Wilmington and North Carolina's politics today? You know, what are the through lines that can directly trace from 1898 through 2000? Because I've heard some historians say the same playbook is still in some ways, maybe in different ways, but it's still active. You know, North Carolina, we're in the midst of early voting. What are some connections?
So the white supremacy movement, the white supremacy platform of the Democratic Party had been its platform every election season since the end of Reconstruction in 1877. 1898 was when it was first successful, and then it became standard operating procedure well into the 20th century. It was challenged by the civil rights movement, and then, you know, we have the red shirts of 1898, and they show themselves again in 1900. They disappear and are replaced by the KKK doing the same sorts of things in the civil rights movement. So there's two of those things. We have voter intimidation. We have removing voters from the polls. And these things happened in 1898, and we're still looking at those same types of things here. We have gerrymandering happening in 1898 and afterwards, and we're still dealing with that. The 6th district along the South Carolina, North Carolina border is the district that Wilmington was in 1898. In this last election round, we had voter fraud with the ballots being, you know, tampered with in that same district. And so there's lots of, gosh, this isn't new history. This is history happening again in many of the same ways when it comes to electioneering and voting and polling places. And one of the big things that the folks were doing in 1898 is they would see somebody on the voter registration list and they'd say, oh, well, that person was arrested and therefore they must be not valid voter. Let's strike their name from the polls. And the men wouldn't realize that they had been stricken from the polls until it was time to vote, and then it was too late. So there's lots of similar things happening in 1898 that we see. Yeah, it's a standard playbook that is then and now, unfortunately, because it works. And so, yeah. And around the middle of the 20th century is when the Democratic and Republican parties sort of switch and focus, and that's a whole other series of classes as well.
There are many series of classes from this. Yeah. Maxwell, I wanted to ask you, do you still live in Wilmington today? Okay. Oh, you need to unmute so we can hear you.
I did. There you go. Yes, I do. I still live in Wilmington.
I wanted to just hear your perspective, and you know, you guys might want to weigh in this too, but how has Wilmington reconciled with this history over these past years? You know, I know in addition to this film, there was finally a monument created. Has Wilmington faced this history? Do you feel the community has started at least to reconcile with this hard history? Where is the town in regards to reconciliation?
Not being able to always be a part of what's going on in Wilmington because I work, I paint houses and stuff, and then I do theater. So a lot of times my time is going on with what's happening in town is not always focused on that. But from what I have seen, and the people who still ask me questions, and the number of Black people who have no idea about 1898, I would say there has not been a great deal of information provided to people, and if it was provided, they didn't take advantage of it. A guy just asked me the other day while I was sitting in my shop, he says, yeah, I heard something about an 1828. I said, no, it was 1898, and I explained to him what had happened. And he walked away with a really strange look, like I didn't know all of that had occurred. And I find myself doing a lot of one-on-one teaching about something that happened so many years ago. I have a granddaughter who is a teacher in Wake Forest. She teaches math. And I gave her the red cape as part of her graduation gift when she graduated from North Carolina Wesleyan. And even those people, educators, don't have a whole lot of idea or knowledge about 1898. I still get tons of questions from people who are intelligent and have no clue about what occurred in that time. And because they have this new monument for Black Lives Matter in 1898, there are still so many people who are resentful of that fact that they did that. People want things to be status quo, antebellum, and it just doesn't work for today's modern age. It really doesn't. It distresses me that things have not changed any more than they have. But Miss Cori, oh man, I got like 2 snaps and a twist for that girl. She is all of that and a bag of chips. I love teachers.
It is. I told y'all. So we're almost at time here, and I did want to just give each of you a final word. I wish we could keep talking. I feel like, we should just turn everybody's camera on and, have a happy hour here together. But as we've said several times, it's so critical to teach this history, but it's also very critical to make sure that we focus on, that we provide the piece of hope, the resilience, the resistance, because it's been there in every piece of history. So in closing, I think I'd just like to hear from each of you, where do you think we find the hope and the resistance, either in events in Wilmington specifically, and I think, Cori, you've addressed that a little bit where you do, but also for today, what do we do with this history in today's world? Because it is so connected, right? So, just in general, what are your thoughts on, maybe it's what we most need to learn from this very palpable history? What do we most need to take away with us and do, or just what are your closing thoughts for us? LeRae, we can start with you.
So I go to Wilmington and around the state a lot talking about 1898. And I have a 45-minute presentation that I do. And I'll go to any group that asks me to talk, whether they're friendly or not. And for the most part, most of the people who attend these talks are people who want to know more and who maybe don't know anything about 1898 or just touch. And they come away from the lecture appalled that this happened here in North Carolina and that they didn't know about it, and that they want to do things today to help prevent that sort of thing in the future. So it restores my faith in humanity many times to see that people are, even though they may not have known about it for whatever reason, that once they do learn about what we all did to each other just for the sake of race and politics, that they then want to make change. And so that's the one thing that I see moving forward that we can do together, is to continue to talk about it. Don't sweep it under the covers any longer. We've got to face what we have in our past collectively and move forward.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Nelson, what about you? What are your thoughts?
For me, it's the classroom. That's where the film originated. And ultimately, I think if we can touch people's hearts and minds in the classroom, that is our best hope for a better and brighter future.
Yeah.
The pain will never go away, the history will never change, but just avoiding it perpetuates those historical crimes.
Mm.
And my mother was a high school teacher in North Carolina. I completely I empathize with the many struggles that teachers face. I understand from student apathy to parental combatants to administrative disregard. Teachers have so much against them, and it's like, got to get those end of course exam grades up, and watch out for those evaluations. At the end of it, this history should not be a political issue. It's a human rights issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope to goodness that we can communicate that with our students, that we should all be fighting for equal rights for everyone. And that, just because the color of your skin shouldn't result in a reduction in the value of your home, shouldn't result in you having to tell your children precisely what to do if you're pulled over by a police officer. And I just, I hope to goodness that that the classrooms can be the place where those human rights can be fully instilled in every student. I hope that we can communicate that importance of learning history with our students, because it directly correlates to today. And it's kind of frightening to imagine that 120 years can go by and so little can change.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. What about you, Nathaniel, the youngest person on this panel other than me? What do you think? That was a joke, obviously. What do you think?
I agree with Nelson. I believe that it starts in the classroom, and you find the hope and the resilience in the fact that we have still accomplished things despite the bigotry, despite the racism. Like, there's hope in the fact that if you look now, like my little sister, she just started high school, and all of her class is now engulfed in the Black Lives Matter movement and what it means, because it's social media has really made it popularized in a way. Like, they don't understand the significance of it. I had a unique experience being at 6 years old. I got this knowledge, and so I have to carry this with me. But they don't understand, the depth of it. But they do understand how important it is to not let white supremacy and bigotry be allowed to continue. And I think if you guys as educators, if you draw the parallels between how easy it is for people to use their political stances to, push out this ideology, kids, we may not fully grasp it, but we're not dumb. We can understand how, okay, wait, the same things that were happening back then are happening today. You can draw the parallels between there. And I know a lot of teachers talk about stereotypes, and they talk about, I think it's important to recognize that there are differences. There are differences in experiences. There are ways that we are perceived because of the color of our skin. It's just a reality. That's just how it is. I don't think you can ignore that. I don't think it is a disservice to try to sugarcoat it and push we are all equal under the law. Everybody's the same. Mm-hmm. It's not a reality. I think that if you find the hope in the honesty of this country, in the fact that this was the promise of our founding fathers, and we have not lived up to it all the way. And it's taken time, but we're not there yet. But we can get there, and this is how. Learn from the history. Do not repeat the history. I'm not the best at articulation.
No, that was beautiful. You are. That was amazing. It's from the mouths of babes. Maxwell, what about you? What do we take away? Closing words. What do you think?
Well, one of the things as I have grown in this country is that this land my country, 'tis of thee, is not in fact a land of sweet liberty. And not finding what I have sung about all my life to be true hurts, because there's so many times when things could have been so much different, that when I went to Our Lady of Perpetual Help School in 1955, and all the parents of the white kids who had withdrawn from school were standing outside watching this colored child go to class, those things would never have happened. People would have applauded that I was old enough to go to school, that I was going to get a better education, but that wasn't the case. And so I have watched growth. I have my friends, my family, they've all changed. And so the growth is good. It's just so slow. So I'm looking for people like Cori, my granddaughter, you, and all the other educators and intelligent people in the world to leave a lasting impression upon the people who are here now, so that they get it. That if you were blind, you would know whose hand you grabbed to help you across the street. And if everybody thought about life as being a blind person and not knowing who you're talking to, you'd probably be a better off person, because you'd be happy when anybody talk to you, because you're blind, you can't see, and you always need help.
Yeah. Thank you, Maxwell.
Oh, and my serious kudos to Nelson. When I met Nelson, he was so much younger. And I just wondered at how such a young white boy could have so much insight. He is a godsend. I love that man. Thank you, Nelson.
I love you too, Maxwell.
Cori, final word.
Connected to today, I love that Nathaniel brought up Black Lives Matter. 1898 has so many parallels to today. So I encourage every teacher in the classroom, make those connections. And primarily, let's look at it, folks. They were trying to prevent people from voting. All right. And so if you can leave your kids high school, 8th grade, in the next election, they're going to be voting. So if once they read a book related to 1898, watch this film, make sure your students know, never let anyone intimidate you, take your power, take your voice, or limit you as they did in 1898. Right now, if I can leave you with any lasting words, we are 9 days from another historic election. It is not 1898 anymore. And although it could be, you can go out and vote. So make sure you do that.
You guys, LeRae, Umfleet, thank you. Nelson Oliver, thank you. Nathaniel Cullors, I just want to squeeze you, thank you. Maxwell Paige, thank you. Cori Greer Banks, for the love of God, thank you. Thank you all for this beautiful film, for your work in the classroom, for your work shining a light on this hard history. I think it's really critical now more than ever that we face this history. If we don't face it, we'll never fix it and move forward. And you all have such a strong and powerful role in that. And so from the bottom of my heart, thank you all so much. We appreciate you being here with our teachers today.
Welcome.
Thank
you, Christie.
So as is my typical MO, we're running just a little bit late here, but I do want to share 2 final things with you guys. I just want to leave you with this last thought from Democracy Betrayed, the book by David Cicelsky and Timothy Tyson, as you walk away, that, this history is still very much with us, as we've said several times throughout this conversation, and we all have to face it. We have to face it to fix it and the repercussions that are still with us today. And it's not easy, but as this quote says, history is not likely to offer tidy lessons or easy answers. And yet we all remain committed to what Charles Chestnut called the shining thread of hope, nurtured even through a hard and bitter history that permitted him to close his account of the Wilmington race riot by declaring, "There's time enough, but none to spare." So please go forward with that sense of urgency. Even if it's a slow burn and it takes time, we need everybody to be committed to shining a light on this history in really empowering ways. The last thing, thank you. The last thing I will share too, if you would like to purchase an individual copy of The Red Cape or an educational screening, You can go to theredcapemovie.com. There's a store there, and Nelson's team has so kindly offered everybody do that within the next week, a 10% discount with the code Carolina K12. It's also worth noting that these guys are not making a profit off of this film. It was self-financed through funding, and this is all, the funds just allow them to do things like this. So know that and check out their store. Very last thing I'll say is join us again back here this Tuesday from 6 to 7:30. The amazing Cori Gerbanks will be back again for Teaching with the Light of Truth in the K-12 classroom. It's a presentation we're going to do about teaching about the amazing Ida B. Wells. Again, you want to talk about somebody who was a resistor and a strong woman. We'll talk about her and her amazing work in speaking out against racial terror lynching. That'll be this Tuesday. You can register on our website there. So with that, I will again say thank you guys so much. We appreciate you. Thanks to everybody who stayed with us, even late, all the way to the end. Stay safe, be well, vote, and we hope to see you back here on Zoom soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.